So now we're going to talk about products and solutions. So Katie, I'll start with you and then I'll head over to Ria as our resident beauty expert. So from the kind of an outsider perspective, well, you're not exactly an outsider now because you're in it. There's this huge lack of products and kind of gaps in the market. Why do you think that the consumer sort of packaged goods market has been so slow to get on this trend? And are you starting to see any green shoots everywhere?
I think the reason the trend has been slower is because of exactly what we've been talking about today, which is there's not been a conversation. And so actually it's not been until recently that actually consumer conversation has driven trend reports, which have driven ultimately, understanding that there is an opportunity for the products. But I also think one of the positives to come out of COVID is it's fundamentally changed a lot of how all of us are working, but also the entrance of new brands. So there's never been more indie brands entering into the market across, beauty, wellness, cosmetics. And what those indie brands are doing is that looking at things differently on every single angle. So whether it's direct to consumer, so I've seen more ASOS packages than ever before during lockdown. Maybe it was out of sheer boredom. I mean, my final tenureship at Charlotte Tilbury, we exceeded our pre-COVID forecasts during lockdown, despite 65% of our business traditionally being through bricks and mortar. And so there is no doubt that direct to consumer and the growth of that channel and that channel that is here to stay has offered a huge platform for independent brands to develop into these categories. What was the original question now? I've forgotten.
And just where we're seeing the movement. And it may be in bricks and mortar. Are you seeing any kind of trends there?
Yeah, I think certainly because us going back to bricks and mortar in London, it does sort of feel like, particularly with everything else in the news, that COVID is sort of gone so quickly. We're not talking about it anymore. And so
overnight.
The positive of that is that shopper behaviours are returning, so absolutely bricks and mortar. I think still from a category perspective, and that's whether we're talking about period products, whether we're talking about intimate hygiene, whatever, I still think there's a big way to go to not have these products marginalised into those categories. That my vision is that all of us as brands sit alongside each other and we all just sit under one holistic category as products for women, rather than having them in these very specific niche categories. Because also it slightly misses, if we think about menopause, 55% of women during menopause will experience dry skin, and so are looking for products that help with lubrication, that help with plumping of skin, that help with deep moisturisation. But there's also loads of the population that just have really dry skin. And so it's not just as single-minded as let's create just products for people in the menopause. It's got to be really authentic products that actually are really fulfilling a consumer need and talking to consumers in the way that they want to be spoken to.
No, absolutely. And I guess Ria, with her finger firmly on the pulse of mainstream retail, what are you seeing in terms of this range of products as a category? Are you starting to see this grow and there be more interest?
I remember working in Space NK 10 years ago, and there was a brand that launched that was all about kind of hormonal changes in the skin, and no one touched it. So number one, I think people were so why would I need to change my skin based on my cycle? It was such an unheard of concept. And I do think in some respect it's whether it's lockdown or just the kind of general slowing down of life and people I think ultimately it's having the time to realise the changes. Quite often with skin, and on my shop floor days, I was like, you tell me about your skin, and people don't know, because we were so busy all the time, and they actually didn't realise, they had no idea what their skin was like. They had to be told, oh, you have this type of skin. It's you should know. In the same way you should know, how you are best kind of being during your cycle, you should also know what your skin type is. You should know, where are your dry patches. So I think it's kind of the communal slowing down and actually seeing in the week before my skin looks a certain way, in the week after, during I'm a bit, it's maybe not my brightest moment. And I think as a category, beauty is so reactive, but it's also so slow in so many ways. We had decades of a 3-step system, cleanse, tone, moisturize, and that was it. And then people were like, an acid, I don't need a toner. Is it a 10-step routine? And people were like, oh my God, I don't know what to do anymore. So it's it's one of the most kind of fast moving, groundbreaking categories, but also there's, I think, quite a lot of resistance. What I always think actually is that ultimately, the decision makers within retail, the buyers and merchandisers, are often women, right? So what's always interesting to me is how there's often been quite a lot of pushback within the retail space, which I think why the growth has been in D2C, because they've been able to actually cultivate that community, probably from learned experience. And then people are thinking about, oh my God, yeah, that's exactly the same for me. And I think, you know, if you're, a forecaster and you're kind of reading these reports and seeing, you know, a D2C brand that is within this space is doing really well, then they take notice. It's always will come from D2C first.
Where overcoming the cyber censorship is so important, because the growth of beauty in D2C, if we want to mirror that in femtech, then we need to be able to say vagina, vulva. If we're getting shadow banned, then you're not going to see the same growth.
I think Ria makes a really interesting point there, which is that the decision makers in retail, and if you go up a level, the decision makers in consumer packaged goods businesses have traditionally, over the last 50 years, been male. So it's no surprise the products you find on your shelves and the decisions about what to list have historically been potentially not focused on products and solutions that we need. Now that is changing, the world is changing. We're seeing positive change in the kind of diversity of the people who make decisions in these big businesses. So we are starting to see that change filter through now into the types of products and services that we have on the shelf. And at the same time, we're seeing a wholesale change in the power players in the retail landscape, pushed along by the pandemic. So the digital players are much more powerful now. We've seen big high street names that we thought would be around forever are no longer here anymore. So retailers are really having to take a really hard look at, are we actually servicing the needs of the people that we're trying to sell to, and how do we bring these new customers in? So they've got to start looking at things that consumers are now saying that they want and they need. So I think it's a great time to be alive right now. It's a great time to be alive in consumer products, let me put it that way, because it's really interesting. There's a lot of change going on.
Yeah, absolutely. Any more before we end today's wonderful panel?
Just from a trend forecasting perspective, there are so many brands out there. I mean, myself and my co-founder Anna are both on a couple of accelerators, incubators. There's so much coming through, and I think the best thing that we can do is all come together, and I think all coming together around this cause has been really powerful. But it's a rising tide, and as much as we can support each other, I think is the way forward.
I'd just like to say, be that employer where women turn around and say, my boss, my company were amazing, because that's going to be great for your staff, but it's also going to be great for your employee brand. So
absolutely, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I think it's kind of like that shared experience and how we all work together is so fundamental to how this is driven in the change, because if we can't all work on this together and kind of try and actively look for those changes we want, whether that's with cyber censorship policy or kind of speaking to retailers, to get that category space, like let's create that space together. Like, we don't need to own it on our own, we want to share it with everybody. I think that's probably one of the most powerful things that can come from this, and I think we've definitely seen that kind of trend shift this year and sort of beyond. So hopefully that means it's the start of really incredible things in this space. So I guess three things that that Rebekah touched upon at the start. I guess the key takeaways is education. It's really, really, really important. Like, we do need to be able to have this conversation with Meta. Hopefully they'll respond to that letter and I'll be there next week. But that education does need to happen from school age, but also sort of up and beyond, so that this isn't a taboo subject anymore. So also we understand our bodies, so we can get the products and the solutions that we need. We need to be inspired, and I think that's thinking about, to Becky's point, like, nothing is more inspiring than going to work and being like, my boss really cares about me. I feel I work somewhere where I can be my absolute best, whatever that might be. And I think kind of like, we spend so much time at work. I wasn't a dick, I wasn't saying anything. But we do, you spend so much of your time with your work colleagues. Like, why aren't you living like your absolute, best opportunity there, right? So there's a huge amount of inspiration that can be done, and work that can be done with policy reform and engagement. Like we're saying, we're all sharing these experiences. We've all kind of brands or businesses that kind of are all related to each other. how do we now engage with buyers and retailers and kind of the giants that we need to help them create that space? You know, a big question we get, you know, we hear a lot is, we love it, but where does it go? Which is why D2C is doing so well, because you're like, well, it can go here, right? Because I've created space for it. So it works right now because we're creating the space for it. So how can we work better to kind of engage those people to help them realise how important this is? So I'd really like to thank my panellists for bringing the energy and for a really great topic. I hope you've all enjoyed it. Thank you very much.